In today's video, what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk a little bit about pen testing, otherwise known as penetration testing. What we want to do is we want to use some tools to scan operating systems to find out if they're currently able to be exploited. Um, we've previously done some port scanning to figure out what ports are currently available, but just knowing that a port's open doesn't necessarily mean that it's able to be compromised. So there's certain tools that you can use to find out if that service that's running on a specific port actually can be compromised. So there's something that's called in the wild. So if you have an exploit that's currently in the wild, that means people know how to take advantage of the problem. So for example, if I'm running an FTP service, that doesn't necessarily mean that that FTP service can be hacked. Just because I'm running FTP doesn't mean that it's vulnerable. Same with the web. I mean, there's tons of websites out there. Just because you have a website up doesn't mean that a hacker can get into your servers, into your server. It just means that that service is running. So there are certain tools that you can run to find out if the current version that you're running has any known vulnerabilities. And can those vulnerabilities actually be exploited? So there's two different groups of pen testing tools. I tend to think of more of the white hat hacking tools, ones that'll scan the system and let you know what vulnerabilities exist, but doesn't necessarily try to exploit the vulnerabilities. So some popular tools would be like Nessus. Nessus is a really good scanning tool. You can point it at a server, it'll scan it, it'll say, here's your current version, here are the known vulnerabilities, and here's what you need to do to fix it. So it doesn't just let you know that it's vulnerable, it lets you know that you're vulnerable and you need to do these actions, you need to apply these updates in order to correct the current problem. So it's an exploration tool. There's another tool called OpenVAS, and OpenVAS is an open source free version of Nessus. It's not necessarily as nice as Nessus is. It's a little bit slower and a little bit more cumbersome, but it will also do something very similar, where it'll scan your system and just let you know what vulnerabilities exist. So there's another set of tools that I consider to be more black hat hacking tools. And these tools will actually try to do the exploits and give you access. So the purpose is to really gain access to a remote system. So the way that the tools work are kind of similar to how antivirus software works. So if you think a little bit about how antivirus software works, you install a program on your computer and it'll scan your computer and look for any known viruses. If it finds a virus, it'll do whatever it needs to do to that virus. But what it does is it basically every day will call home, call the mothership, see if there's any new virus definitions. It'll download those virus definitions, and then it'll add those to its scans. So that way next time it scans, it'll have a new set of definitions to scan for. So that's how antivirus works. So basically the hacking community has done something very similar. So metasploit is more of that black hat hacking tool, and they've created it in such a way that it's very modularized. So anybody can create a module that can take advantage of an exploit, and they can add it to the metasploit framework. And so what happens is when I install metasploit, I have the ability to check for updates, and if there's new modules out there, it'll download those modules, and next time I do a security scan, it can use those modules to see if the server is currently able to be exploited using the new module that it downloaded. So it's kind of like the opposite. Instead of keeping the system secure, it's actually grabbing vulnerabilities and finding out if they're vulnerable. But it's the same principle or the same concept. This is actually really useful because the modules get introduced very, very quickly. For example, Heartbleed was a really big issue not that back, and everyone wanted to know, well, is this vulnerable or not? So, for example, Heartbleed used SSL. It actually was a vulnerability within the Open SSL architecture, so that way you could actually read the server's memory if you had a certain version of OpenSSL installed. So there was an issue and became vulnerable, and it became 0 day or out in the wild, so people knew about it. And somebody wrote a module for metasploit, so that way the metasploit framework could take advantage of that vulnerability. Now, like for example, at the college, we buy a lot of hardware devices like DLPs and stuff like that. That it's just a hardware device that you plug into your network. But the hardware devices are all running software underneath the hood, and they're using SSL. Even like we're connected up to the vSphere client. Well, we've got a vSphere server where some admin just put the disk in, clicked next till the box went away, and hey, we've got a server up and running. I'm sure it was probably a little bit more than that, but it's the concept that somebody did something and then it's up and going. They didn't actually configure, they don't know underneath the hood how everything was written, especially with the hardware devices. But it does have an IP address and it could be vulnerable. So we were able to use tools like Metasploit to scan the network and find out if it was able to be exploited or not. So in that specific case, what we did was somebody set up a server that was known to be vulnerable. The vendor said, yeah, this is an issue. We're coming up with a patch for it. So somebody was able to put that server up in a test environment, and we were able to scan it with Metasploit and find out that yes, it definitely did return a positive result, that it is vulnerable. So then once we were able to do that, we could then start to test each one of the physical hardware devices that were in question to find out if those were vulnerable. And we were actually even able to find out that certain controllers were vulnerable, that the manufacturer never even contacted us about any type of updates or any plan to fix it. So it really gives you that ability to take a deep look at your environment. And then we're actually able to scan the entire system to find out what ones are vulnerable or not. So when we scan the system at the college, what we do is we've got production. All right. So when people go to www.fetc.edu, they're hitting a production server, or if they're registering for classes or dropping classes, all of that's production. All of those servers are actually mirrored onto identical hardware, and that's called staging. So for example, a web developer will develop it in a dev environment, and then once they're ready to get it to production, they actually push it to a staging environment. The staging environment gives the customers the ability to look at the new features and the new updates before it actually goes to production. So it's kind of like this limbo where people can look at it. People externally can't, but internal employees can look at it and give it its final approval, and then administrators can then take it from staging and move it out into production. So it also creates that separation of concern, so that way developers won't be touching production, and it kind of keeps everything organized in a clean fashion. The main thing that I'm trying to communicate is these type of tools I would never run against production. If I ran it against like the production EDU, the people that are writing the modules don't care if the servers crash. Matter of fact, quite often services will crash because they'll be taking advantage of a buffer overflow, which is basically corrupting the memory or overflowing the buffer that the memory holds to shove a program in there to execute it. So very often it makes the system very, very unstable. And the last thing you want to do is be the one caused for crashing the production environment, and then sales are being lost or customers are being dissatisfied. So you always need to make sure that when you're doing any type of scan, specifically a pen testing scan, you want to make sure that you're scanning something that's not currently being used by customers. So anyway, with all that being said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to power on my Tiger box. With the Tiger box, we're running multiple operating systems on there. So we've got a version of Kali that's up and running, and we also have a version of Windows 7 on there. So if I were to boot onto the Windows 7, I'd need to select that from the list. I believe Kali is the default. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and I'm going to open console. I always do that so that way I can see the boot menu as soon as I power it on. So then I hit the play button, and then I'm going to wait until that menu appears so that way I can select it off the list. This becomes more important, especially when you're trying to boot into the XP. So I actually clicked on Kali, so it automatically booted into Kali. But you did see the menu for a second. Okay, so I'm in Kali, so that's good. I'm going to go full screen because from home I disconnect and reconnect, and I'm sure you guys have seen that as well. If you go full screen, that makes it a little less annoying. Okay, so I'm going to just click on Other. The user that I want to log into is root, and the password is Tor. In the real world, I definitely wouldn't use those as the passwords. I'm just doing that so we all stay on the same page. I'd probably use a passphrase, something more complex. Okay, so here's Kali. It's basically an operating system that's got a whole bunch of hacking tools in it. So there's a Kali Linux menu, and there's these are all different tools that you can use, from cracking web keys to social engineering, forensics, and also pen testing. So there's the vulnerability analysis. There's the OpenVAS that we talked about before, so you can actually do OpenVAS to scan systems. So I do want to encourage you to kind of play around in here a little bit. There's the exploitation tools, and metasploit is here. So we're actually going to be using metasploit, but metasploit can be somewhat complicated, especially when you're doing it from the command line. I actually like to use the Armorage, and it's a front-end application that's built on top of Armorage. So before I do that, I'm not going to start up Armorage. I need to actually start up some services first. By default, Kali doesn't start up like every service just because it would really slow the system down. So what I do is I will start up the services that I need when I'm running certain things. So the first thing I want to do is I'm just going to start up the Postgres SQL. That's going to need to be running in order to run Armorage. So I'm just going to do service, and it's going to be Postgres QL, and then start. Okay, so this is basically saying this is the service that I want to start. If I wanted to stop it, I could put stop in there, but it's not running, so I'm going to start it. So basically it's kicking up our database, and our database is up and going. So I also want to start up metasploit, so I'm going to do really the same thing. It's going to be service, but instead of the Postgres, it's going to be metasploit. I hit my up arrow key. So it's going to be service metasploit start. So I've done this previously. The first time I did it, it popped up information on here telling me that the username is going to be something like MSF3. So just so that way, if you see that, that's something to kind of keep in mind. I've done this already, so the database already has the user created in it. So at this point, I'm going to check and see if there's any updates. I don't think it should be a big deal, but I'm just going to type in MSF update. I'm going to hit enter. So it's going to check the Metasploit framework to see if there's any updates. Currently I don't have any updates available, but if there were some, this is where it would download those updates and I would be able to scan with it. Typically what I do is if there are updates that come down, I'll actually stop the service and restart the service just to make sure it's pulling everything in. I don't know if I actually have to do that, I just do that. Okay, so at this point I'm just done with the terminal. Everything that's needed to be run has been taken in account. So I'm not sure if you noticed, but I do have two servers. I've got my server 2003. This is going to be one of the servers I'm going to scan. The IP address for me is 35. You're going to want to grab your own IP address. I also have my Windows 7, which its IP address is not shown, so I'm going to just quickly log in and get that IP address. Let's go full screen here. I'm just going to go to my CMD, my command line, and I'm just going to type in ipconfig. Okay, so 10.7.33. Okay, so I got 33 and 35. Those are the two machines that I've got that I'm gonna try to break into. Okay, so at this point I'm gonna go back to full screen on my Kali. I've got two targets that I'm gonna try to exploit. So from the applications menu, and the applications menu can be kind of cumbersome because it flies out quite a bit. But I'm going to go over to my Kali, and then I want to go into the exploitation. And I always want to go underneath Metasploit because it really is a framework that runs Metasploit. But I'm going to go to the armorage under Network Exploration. So it gives me my local host because the database is running here, the port. Right here, the user, make sure that's MSF3. And I'm just leaving the password test. I'm going to click on connect. So the service isn't running, so I'm just going to start up the RPC. I'm just going to say yes. So this box always kind of scares me a little bit because it says connection refused on it, but it's trying to connect, so don't sweat it. It'll probably come up okay. Okay, so here's Armorage. This is loaded. We could navigate through and try to do an exploit manually. So if I was doing Windows, and if I knew like a Windows, let's just say it's running IIS, we could actually pick a specific exploit here and try to run that. So if I wanted to, I could try to run one specific module. But what I like doing, it's a little bit more noisy, but it's the Hail Mary. In previous versions of Metasploit, they called this autopwn. Basically, it's going to scan the server. It's going to figure out what ports are open, and then it'll try to match up exploits based on the port to give you access. So that's what we're going to do. I think it's just a little bit easier. I mean, a true hacker wouldn't do this. They would want to be more stealthy because if you're like throwing everything at the machine just to see what sticks, it may be noticed, especially if they're running like an intrusion detection system. So a hacker would want to be a little bit more stealthy. But we're actually white hat. We're going to run these exploits just to see if our system is able to be compromised. So if I'm noisy, I don't really care because I am hitting this against my own machine. So the first thing I want to do is I want to add my hosts. So in here I can actually see my hosts. So I'm just going to click on hosts, and then I'm going to go to add host. Now if I was scanning like a whole subnet, I could use Nmap and it'll just do like a sweep and pull every single machine in. I don't recommend doing that, especially if you're on somebody else's network. So I'm going to be careful when I do this. So I'm going to go hosts, add host, and I'm just going to type in the IP addresses of my two machines. So I had 10.7.66.33 was one of them, and it was 10.7.66.35 was my other one. And you can boot up all the machines. I mean, you can do like your Linux box. It doesn't matter. Just play with your machines. I don't want you crashing somebody else's machine. So I'm just going to add those hosts. So it added two different hosts. Black screen means that it doesn't know the operating system. So the next thing I do is I run a scan on them. I just right click on the machine and go to scan. And what it's doing is it's looking to see what ports are open. And that's why we needed the database to be installed, so that way it would be able to store this information, and it just makes it a little bit easier for us. So it found that this is a Windows machine. So I'm going to scan this one now. I mean, they're both Windows. One's a Windows 7 and one's a Server 2003. I believe my 35 is my 2003 and the 33 is my Windows 7. Yeah, so that's my Windows 7. Okay, so at this point, I've identified the operating system. I've done the scans on it. So what I can do is up here in this menu, I can go to my attack and just do the Hail Mary. You could manually pick out each individual exploit you want to run, but since I don't really know too much about what ports and what services, I'm just going to do a Hail Mary. So this is just saying, hey, you're going to flood. I mean, this is going to be noticeable. Once you start, you can't stop. So I'm just going to say yes. Let's just do it. And if I were doing a pen test, I actually feel more comfortable doing the Hail Mary for a pen test, just because I would hate to skip over a specific module just because I didn't know that that was something that the server ran. So this did a scan, it knows the ports, it knows the operating system, and it's matching up those modules for us. So if you notice that my 35 just turned into a red lightning bolt, that means it just got compromised. So it was able to find a vulnerability and able to exploit that vulnerability. So in a second, it's going to list my sessions. Okay, so it looks like I've got two different meterpreters. So a meterpreter shell is basically something that metasploit uses to give us a window into that machine. So at this point, we can do quite a bit to this machine. If I right click on it, I see I've got two different meterpreters. Basically that means two different windows into the machine. It found two different vulnerabilities that have been exploited successfully. So at this point, if I go to my meterpreter, I've got things that I can do. I can escalate it, I can migrate it, I can interact with it. So normally what I do is, if like meterpreter number 2 exploited something that didn't give us full administrative access, what I like to do is I like to first go over to the escalate permissions. So I'm just going to hit escalate permissions. Okay, so it wasn't able to do that. So I'm going to go to meterpreter 1, go to access and go escalate. Alright, so if something goes wrong, I'm going to try to migrate it. See if that works. So when you migrate something, you're basically taking it from one service and spawning a brand new service, and then you'll be running underneath a different thread on their server. Okay, well, we're going to see what we can do here. So I'm going to right click on it. My escalation of permissions not working, but I don't know if it's going to be a big deal. There's a bunch of things that we can do. So let's just see if we can like grab a screenshot. So if I go to Explore, I can browse the files. I can grab a screenshot. So I'm going to do that. If there was a webcam on there, I could have grabbed a webcam. Alright, so it looks like a black screen. Yeah, there's my server 2003. So my screensaver is running. So I can't really see too much interesting. But if somebody was actually working on it, I could refresh this and, watch. Let's see if we can browse their files. So I'm going to go to the Explorer, Browse Files. And you can kind of slide this around too to make the window bigger. Okay, so I've got my System32 directory, and it looks like I've got a lot of files in here. So I'm just going to change this to this C:\\. I'm going to hit enter. Yep, this definitely looks like a server. Just out of curiosity, I'm going to see if I can make a directory. I'm just going to call it Joe. And say OK. And it definitely looked like it created a directory for me. So at this point, we can upload files and we can do quite a bit. Okay, so we're browsing files. Let's see if we can steal their passwords. So at this point, if I wanted to steal passwords, I would go to credentials. Underneath my view menu, there's a credentials. If I do this, what it's going to do is it's going to pull down all the hash files. Maybe I need to go to my interpreter. And dump hashes. So I'm going to first dump the hashes. I'm going to use the lassie method. And then let's go to view credentials. There we go. Okay, so I guess I needed to dump the hashes before I did the credentials. So these are all of the hashes, the hashed passwords. We can crack the passwords, so they've got a tool. I think it's Jack the Ripper. And I'm just going to launch this. So at this point, I'm just kind of playing around. We've completely got access, so we can really do pretty much anything that we want. We can upload files, we can delete files, download files. Okay, so it's in here underneath this tab, cracking the passwords, and I believe that the passwords will show up either here or here. I'll just let this thing run. So some other things that you can do is you can get a command shell. Alright, so once you have that CMD shell, your command line, you can actually create a user and a password. Browse files. Yeah, so if they had a webcam on there, you could look at them through their webcam. You could do an ARP scan, so that way if you wanted to maybe try to wedge this machine in between two other machines, you could do like a man-in-the-middle attack. Okay, so here it was able to crack the Tor password. Guest doesn't have a password, and administrator doesn't have a password. So that's our server 2003. We created that web dev. That was the one we did on a previous lab. So I was able to crack that. Okay, so after hitting refresh, I can see that. Okay, so let's see if I can get a command shell. Okay, yeah, so I've got a command shell, so if I did like a dir for directory listing, I can see my Joe directory, alright. So we truly, I mean, we're on this machine now. So if I wanted to create a user, I could do like net user, and I'm just going to make up a username. I'm just going to make it hacker, which would be a horrible username if you're trying to stay stealthy. Make up a password. I'll just call it password. And then it's a /add. So through the command line, we can actually add new users into the system. So I'm doing net user hacker, and then my password's password, and then /add. So if I hit enter, at this point, it said that the command completed successfully, which means now there's a user. But the user is just a limited user. It's not truly like an administrator. So I wouldn't be able to like remote desktop or do things that maybe a normal person would be able to do if they were an administrator. So I'm going to add this user into the administrators group. So I'm going to do net local group. And the local group that I want to add this user into is called the administrators group. ADMINISTRATORS, administrators. And then the user that I want to add into that group is going to be called hacker. And then /add. So basically you just identify what group you want to add what user into. So I'm just going to hit enter here. So yay! So I successfully added that into that group, that user into that group. So anyways, I just wanted to give you a quick overview of Armor Edge. And it actually looks like our Windows 7, at least currently when I'm making this video, seems to be, we currently don't have any exploits that can run against that. But I wouldn't use this as the only tool. I mean, if I was truly going to be doing serious pen testing, I would do other tools. I'd probably use like OpenVAS, and I'd also use Nessus. Nessus is actually the one that I prefer. It's a commercial product, so the company will actually have to, pay to get that software. But that software is fairly easy to use. It's actually easier than Armor Edge, and they've got great support. But anyways, so what I want to do is I'm going to grab a screenshot of this. So for this lab, we're only going to have one screenshot. So I'm just going to take the Tiger box and do my screenshot. I'm going to open up Word. And then at the bottom of this document, what I'd like you to do is just briefly summarize the benefits of using these tools, as well as the dangers of using these tools. So I mean, you want to talk maybe a little bit about how to do it safely. If you can come up with some options on how to protect a system. I know a lot of people over the years have said, I don't believe that this should be legal. People shouldn't be able to use these tools. And the fact is I believe that the criminals will use tools like these no matter what. We need to keep these tools to help us keep ourselves safe. So especially when they're releasing modules at such a fast rate, it really lets me know if my system's compromised or not, or able to be compromised, because it at least gives me something to analyze. So anyways, hopefully you enjoyed the lab, and I'll talk to you soon.